Good, thank you very much, Lisa. It's nice to be back here again. Good. Yes, the show is on until February 16th at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Could we have the lights, please? Thank you. As a young man, in one of the very few talks that Charles Rennie Mackintosh gave, he described the Scottish character as combining Puritanism with Romanticism, abstinence with mysticism. What a complex mixture. But I think it's precisely the acknowledgement of that paradox of opposites which helps us to understand aspects of his personality and his work, and also to accept the seeming contradictions and confusions, even confusions about the photographs of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. These are both of the same man. On the left-hand side, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, aged about 25, as you can see, alert, a kind of leader amongst his friends, good-looking and dark-haired, with that sort of Celtic, Highland, Scottish good looks. On the right-hand side, you have him in his early 50s, when he's put on a great deal of weight. He looks much more introspective, much more passive, and in fact it's at a time when he was battling with depression and alcohol, and also when he was hardly designing, he was hardly working as an architect at all. So that's the first set of paradoxes. The second is that, as you see on the left-hand side, his own motto, if you like, of 1901, there is hope in honest error, none in the icy perfections of the mere stylist. So that looks as though, if we were thinking about a room, that would mean that if the opposite is of mere style, is what? Well, I suppose it would mean that you would think about a room which was comfortable, a room that didn't draw a lot of attention to itself, with practical, useful furniture, etc. But yet, on the right-hand side of simply exactly the same time, we have the music room, which is a design for the house for the art lover, and surely that is mere style. That is absolute style. That is only style, and superb. Superb as it is. So when we look at the chairs, for instance, they are very, very low seated, and they are very, very high backed. As you were looking at the flower vases here, which are sort of in the middle of the room, and then all the other, the piano with the organ at the far end, the banners, etc., the roses which go through everything. So there's no way that you could put somebody else's furniture in that room, because the style is so predominant that anything else would look completely foreign. So that's a set of paradoxes too. What he says doesn't seem to go with what he actually does. Another set on the left-hand side, that's the outside of a house for an art lover, and of 1901. And that's the kind of architecture which made art historians, especially architectural historians, say of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, it is hardly too much to say that the whole modernist movement in European architecture derives from him. That was in 1924, and Pevsner and all sorts of other architectural historians have continued to take that line, to see him as a pioneer of functionalism, as a pioneer of the Bauhaus, as a pioneer of the 20s, 30s style, and this is 1901. And what they're looking at is, of course, the cut-off, the plain surfaces, the cut-off roof, the kind of turret which ends abruptly, and that kind of bay window with the horizontal windows within them. So it's it's a wonderful sort of 30s type of a style, but that's 1901. So here we have him as a pioneer of modernism and functionalism. On the other side, we have the recent book by a man called Timothy Neate, Part Seen, Part Imagined. And what he argues is that it's quite impossible to understand Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work without seeing him as a product of the 90s, as a product of the symbolism of the 90s. And he goes as far as to suggest that even though they weren't members, direct members of the Rosicrucian Society, or the Theosophical Society, the Madame Blavatskys, etc., that he says that their ideals and their ideas fit in very, very closely with that kind of spiritualism which runs through the 1890s. Timothy Neate also puts an enormous amount of emphasis on the partnership between Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his wife. On the left-hand side, the Pevsners and the architectural historians tend to see Margaret MacDonald's work, which is what you see on the right-hand side, as an impediment, in a way, to the idea of modernism. If only you could get rid of the wife's style, then you could see Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work as leading straight into the 20s and 30s. Timothy Neate says, of course, not so. He says Margaret MacDonald was the inspiration, the centre, the motor behind most of Mackintosh's best work. So that's two very different kinds of approaches. Coming out from Timothy Neate is the idea that this very famous chair there, which was made for one of Miss Cranston's tea rooms, as I said, he says that, of course, we can look at it purely as a wonderful sculptural piece of furniture with the long back and with a kind of shield-like top and with an abstract pattern which is pierced through the top. On the other hand, he says that if you really know Charles Rennie Mackintosh's background, then in fact you would relate that chair to Rossetti on the left-hand side, and this particular painting out of all of them. And so here he says, well, look at the red hair of Rossetti's painting. Well, Margaret MacDonald had eminently lovely, beautiful copper-coloured hair, and then above that you see a halo, and then within the halo you see a dove. The dove, of course, is the symbol of love. It's a symbol of peace. It was the dove that brought the sprig of life to Noah, and it's also the symbol of the Holy Spirit. Well, that's a great deal of symbolism for a mere chair to carry. On the other hand, reading Timothy Neate and looking at these two images and knowing that Charles Rennie Mackintosh did abstract from nature, from birds, from plants, etc., then maybe it isn't too far-fetched to see in that abstract sign, an abstracted sign of the dove, of the symbol of peace, so that you would sit in that chair, and then above your head, because this goes far up above you, would be this symbol of peace. So fascinating. Yet another set of contradictions, in a way, is that there are people who say that they're not terribly interested in his architecture, they're not terribly interested in the interiors, that they're a little bit too pink, too purple, too fey, too rosy for them. But what they do go for are the watercolours of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. 1915, you have this beautiful, almost a botanical illustration of the witch hazel on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the watercolours which he did in France towards the end of his life when he was doing no architecture at all. So all those kinds of approaches and contradictions within Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work. So what can we do with all that, and where can we go? Well, I think the only thing to do is to kind of go back to the beginning, in a way, and to go through his life and to look at some more of his work, and not necessarily resolve any of those contradictions, but actually to see that those contradictions are held within Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work itself. So where does he come from? Well, as I think we've mentioned, he's Scottish. He was born in 1868. He was born in Glasgow, which is on the west side of Scotland, as opposed to Edinburgh, which is on the east side. His father, which is a most wonderful photograph of him, and he was on the right-hand side. He was in the police force. He was a clerk, and then he was a superintendent of the police force. And here we see him, where all of them are wearing kilts, etc. And the police force of that year was evidently the world champion in the tug-of-war team. And there he is. A pretty dour-looking man he looks, like there. Well, we know very little really about Charles Rennie Mackintosh's relationship to his parents. He did live at home for a long time, but his father was evidently a good Calvinist. One doesn't do very much on a Sunday in Scotland at that particular time. But the one thing that Charles Rennie Mackintosh does seem to have got from his father is a love of plants. And his father was a very, very keen and very good gardener. So the other thing to remember, I think, about his childhood is that he was the second of 11 children, and he wasn't a terribly strong child. He was born with a club foot, and he also had a kind of lazy eyelid over one eye. So he was rather a delicate child, but he left school when he was about 15, and he was immediately apprenticed to an architectural office. He finished his architectural apprenticeship there of 5 years, and in 1889 he joined the firm of Honeyman and Keppie, and he's going to remain with that firm until he's sacked in 1913. And here he is on the right-hand side. This is the young staff of the architect's office, and that's his friend Herbert McNair. While he's an apprentice, and also while he's a young draftsman at Honeyman and Keppie, he attends the Glasgow School of Art, the old Glasgow School of Art. And in fact, he attends it for about 8 years in his free time, that is, in the evenings. And at first, he seems to take draftsmanship courses, and like all young architects, he's being trained in a variety of styles. And this very ordinary, rather boring drawing on the right-hand side won him a traveling scholarship in 1890, and off he went in 1891 to Italy for just 3 months, where he did what all architectural students would do. He did a lot of sketching of buildings, and he also visited some museums. On the other hand, as far as I can see, there's absolutely no influence of Italian architecture in his work at all. What is much, much more important is Scottish indigenous architecture, the vernacular architecture of the 17th century. So, for instance, the tower houses that you get on the right-hand side, there are many of them in Scotland from the 17th century. So they're defensive-looking, rather vertical buildings, but at the same time, they're still not quite castles. They're residences, but still have the defensive look about them. And sometimes they have little turrets and little conical-shaped roofs on the top of those little corbelled towers. And here's a smaller version on the left-hand side. That's a smaller domestic version with the crow-stepped gables, and both of them, as you can see, are harled. Harling is just an equivalent to the Italian stucco. It's a kind of white mixture that you put on the outside, which Charles Rennie Mackintosh was very attracted to. It makes, of course, the building look much more sculptural, and you sort of have the solids. In a way just pierced by some of the voids of the windows. He also liked the way in Scottish vernacular architecture that windows just were sort of pierced higgledy-piggledy. There's nothing regular, there's nothing Georgian. He wasn't interested in the Edinburgh, the wonderful Georgian terraces with their balanced windows, etc. It was the 17th century Scottish vernacular architecture that he looks back on. So here we've got him going as a young architect, but he came into contact with a group of very innovative women students at the Glasgow School of Art. And these are his friends. They're out in a weekend in the country, and it's terribly interesting because it shows us the woman here that he seemed to have an understanding with at the beginning of the 90s. There she is there, and here he is here. and then you can see that he's serenaded by the women on the right-hand side. And then we have Margaret MacDonald and her friend Frances MacDonald, and it was Margaret whom he's going to marry in 1900. There she is there, sitting next to Jessie. So it seems to be that having become a great friend of all these women, that he seems to be influenced by the kinds of things that they're interested in. And so instead of just being an architect, he begins to be interested in the applied arts, as we would say. And the MacDonalds and the other women were very busy designing embroidery, and designing beaten tin. They were also doing posters, invitations, etc., printed work, whole varieties, stained glass windows, etc. And Charles Rennie Mackintosh seems to have become, just at that particular time, terribly interested in all the applied arts as well. And their style was very influenced by Beardsley. This is 1892, the very famous illustrations to Salome. So it's a kind of Art Nouveau style, which is very linear, relies on these long plant-like lines, and you can see in Frances MacDonald's work the same kind of elongated women, one on either side, and the same, in a way, interest in using plant-like stems and branches for the decoration of this mirror called Honesty. So when we look at Charles Rennie Mackintosh's early furniture, this is a linen closet on the right-hand side. You can say on the one hand it seems to come straight out of the arts and crafts movement, the William Morris type of movement, which he was certainly very, very interested in, and also read Ruskin and read Morris, etc. On the other hand, when you look at the metal decoration there, you can see that there are two women sort of kneeling, looking at each other here and also there, and this kind of style of the rather sort of emaciated women comes straight out of, or is parallel with, something like Frances MacDonald's work of the pond on the left-hand side, where you see two sort of insect larvae about to become dragonflies from the pond, and then you have these strange sort of ghoul-like shapes, which sort of look like ghouls, sort of ghosts, or look like tadpoles, or look like seamen. They sort of seem to be strangely sort of asexual, but also sexual at the same time. And that kind of style, which won them the name of the Spook School in Glasgow, became to be thought of as the Glasgow style in the 1890s. And so Charles Rennie Mackintosh was very much part of it. He, like the others, also did some watercolours at this time, and this one has a most interesting and significant title. It's called The Tree of Personal Effort and the Sun of Indifference. So what we have are three very straight-looking trees which come out of the fertile green earth and the bulbs and the roots here, and they go straight up to a kind of more mystical, rarefied top layer, where you have a sort of combination of buds and flowers and heart-like shapes, as though the fertility blossoms out at the very top. And the idea of the sun of indifference, that I think is very critical, because there was something in Charles Rennie Mackintosh's character which made him feel as though, as a young architect, he was up against enemies, he was up against indifference, he was up against unsympathetic people, whether it be within his own architectural profession or outside there. And he was, his personality was such that he was sort of, in a way, he could be very combative. He could see the enemy out there, and he could also, on the other side of it, he could also talk in an extremely passionate way about what he was interested in. Well, what was he interested in? Well, he was extremely interested, as of course one would expect for an ambitious young architect to evolve a new Scottish style. And I also stress Scottish because he did. So, for instance, in a talk about Scottish architecture, he says, "This is a subject dear to my heart and entwined amongst my innermost thoughts and affections, the architecture of our own country, just as much Scotch as we are ourselves, as indigenous to our country as our wild flowers, our family mottos, our customs, and our political constitution." And he goes on to say that there are too many styles which are far too eclectic, looking towards the neo-Gothic, looking towards the neo-Tudor, looking towards the neo-this, and that what he wanted to do was to create a new Scottish style which came out of that vernacular. When he talked about symbolism, it was much the same idea, that he felt that the symbols that other people were using were tired, that they had been overused, and that what he wanted to do was to develop a new personal vocabulary, which would become a general vocabulary. So this isn't terribly far from, as I said, from most from the ambitions of most young architects and artists. But he certainly stated that was the case for him. On the right-hand side, I put one of his interior designs, just so that one can see how close his work in a symbolist watercolor is to what became his style for interiors. So there you have one of the most obvious symbols is the rose, and the rose was so important to him, and also, of course, to the other people within his group. And why the rose? Well, the rose was a kind of symbol of sensuality, but it was also a symbol of pure beauty. The rose, of course, the symbol of it goes back and back and back, and was used in medieval times as in a secular way, but also in a religious way. And for Charles Rennie Mackintosh, it was, I think, the combination of the secular and also the spiritual, which he was so attracted to, and the rose being the symbol of art to him as well. So in a bedroom here with a fireplace and the wardrobes, you can see how the rose and the plant-like sort of linear quality, which you see in the watercolor, is transferred into his designs for wardrobes and for decoration above as a frieze going around the room. What of his architecture at this time? Well, he himself, wasn't so interested, I don't think, in some of his architecture. This is a kind of neo-Gothic exercise in Queen's Cross Church, which, as you can see, is still there. On the other hand, the stained glass window on the right is terribly interesting, and inside, some of the details, some of the carving is just absolutely fabulous. The bleeding heart on the left-hand side, or the heart, which could come from the plant. There is actually a flower which is called the bleeding heart. And then, interestingly enough, the bleeding heart was actually one of the emblems of the Mackintosh clan. So there might be a sort of double meaning there. On the right-hand side, the bee. The bee is a symbol of the soul. The bee is also the busy worker bee, and you can also take the bee as a symbol of fertility, as it goes from plant to plant, fertilizing and pollinating. So within this church, even though he himself is not doing any of the carving, there's a kind of medieval carver's attitude, towards everything. Nothing was too much bother for Charles Rennie Mackintosh when it came to the details for when he was designing. And so he's far from functionalism, far from streamlining, that he loved thinking of special designs for the special either screens or chairs or communion tables or whatever he was designing. And it wasn't a kind of design in a vacuum. At his best, he always had a commission, and he designed for the commission, for the particular place, for the particular space, for the particular size of furniture or whatever that he was designing. That's what he was really best at. So having said that that church wasn't terribly interesting, what is interesting? Well, I think the Glasgow School of Art, which was built between 1897 and 1899, is extremely interesting. This is the front, which faces north, and this is the back. So it's in a very difficult site. It's at the top of a hill with not much space to get back to, to actually see it. And he won it as a competition, but I have a feeling that he was allowed to go in for the competition from Kepi and Honeyman, probably because it was supposed to be a very plain, quote, building and a very cheap building. It was to be a school for artists. He wanted something plain and functional for the new School of Art. They didn't have much money, and in fact it had to be built in 2 sections, and they knew that before they even started. And another sort of paradox that we find within Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work is that you can have something which, on the one hand, is very plain and functional looking. On the other hand, there are areas within this functional looking building which are enriched in an incredibly ornamental and decorative way. So if we just look at the plainness, you can see that these enormous great windows face north, wonderful studio spaces on that floor, equally on this floor, also in the basement. And in order to get even more light into the basement, he cut out the wall and put in railings instead. Here you get the ornamentation. Where else do you get the ornamentation? Everything to do with the entrance, which is not quite in the center. It's as though, okay, here we have the big plain windows, but everything within that entrance block and this sort of these references to the towers is going to be given special attention. The back is terribly interesting because it goes back to this Scottish vernacular architecture where you just pierce the walls where and when you need the windows without with a kind of wonderful asymmetry. When you come to the sides of the building, the side facades, they are absolutely odd in the extreme, sometimes very dour looking. You can be traipsing up this steep hill there and look to the left-hand side, and it's a grey day. You come up, you see this great, enormous area of just blank wall. In fact, these two are later windows. And again, I think it refers to Scottish vernacular architecture, where you often do get the same idea of great areas of wall with no windows. There was a special tax on windows, and so you had as few as possible. And on the other side, on the west side, you also get the same idea of certain areas just left absolutely plain, and then other areas which are given marvelous treatment of great big oriel windows which go all the way up the building. On this particular facade, you can see that, as against the plainness, you suddenly get an amazing variety of windows. And of course, the moment you have different sizes of windows, it's much more expensive. But somehow he got away with it. So you have a sort of suggestion of a little turret going up here with a nice sort of finial on the end. You get windows which are recessed, windows which come out, etc. All sizes and shapes. A delightful, sort of mannered, in a way of dealing with those facades. In the central area, the same idea, all sorts of different windows doing different things, and then this wonderful wrought iron which goes over the entrance with the lamp, and which also goes up against these brackets which go up against the windows, almost, and the end of it is almost like a claymore sword, a Scottish claymore sword. The handle bit that goes over your hand is and so I'm sure there's a reference reference to Scottishness there. And then when we look at the details of these rails here, you can just see this is what they look like there. And then when we look at the details of them, they're absolutely incredibly beautiful. They're like reeds which grow up very, very thin, and then you have a sort of bunching together, and out of the bunching together you have more stems which go up, and then a kind of emblem which goes up about another sort of 8 or 10 feet. And at the end of there are 8 of these emblems, which look as though they're just very good-looking abstract shapes. But reading Timothy Neat, one sees that in fact this is a scarab which is the symbol for resurrection in Egyptian mythology, and others are bees and trees, the tree of life, etc., and flowers and other references to his sort of private vocabulary. So out of this private vocabulary comes very, very good-looking and modern-looking design. On the tops of the 2 little towers are these finials of the birds and the bells, and which are the symbol of the city of Glasgow. Inside, first of all, let's just talk about functionalism, where you have one great corridor with all the studios going off it. Very practical indeed. Here's the basement studio for the sculptors who had a door which went out on the hill so that they didn't have to take their sculpture up any stairs. Great big, wonderful windows letting in lots of light. However, when you go along the passages, and then suddenly you come across these dark stained doors, but pierced within the doors are the leaded glass ornaments. So here you can see a butterfly, and on this side you can see the rose. So you go into studio number 45, and there you have the rows of art before you actually go into a room which inside is very plain. So to go back to this interest in symbolism, what he said was, the power the artist has of representing objects to himself explains the hallucinatory character of his work, the poetry which pervades it, and its tendency towards symbolism. And of course, therefore, his ideal, which was to renew and reinvigorate the whole language of symbolism. If one goes into the director's room, you go towards the door, and the light comes through the leaded glass here, and one feels, yes, this is certainly something organic. One's not quite sure what it is, but it seems to have a reference to a bulb, like a hyacinth bulb, or maybe an apple which has been halved, or, of course, a buds of a flower, something organic. One goes inside the director's room, a marvelous room of light flooding in from these great big windows, and then later on he was also asked to design the furniture for this room. But then you suddenly realize that if we talked about the organicness of the design in the door, but then you look at the clock there, or you look at the backs of the Mackintosh chairs, and they aren't organic at all. They're geometric, little squares cut out in the back of the chairs, or squares in the clock. And so at exactly the same time, Charles Rennie Mackintosh was carrying the style, or the organic style on the one hand, and the much more geometric style on the other. In this closet here, you have another of these little insets of leaded glass, and here's a detail of it on the right-hand side, and it's the swallow. The swallow, which is a symbol of summer, symbol of beauty, a symbol of transience as well, because of course they go away, but on the other hand they come back again. And it's also, as the swallow is the emblem of spiritual yearning. Yet again, if we look into it, there seems to be a great deal behind these wonderful, beautiful, abstracted shapes. If you bear in mind this sort of checkerboard effect from the chairs, and then we also go to the passageways on the right-hand side with their tiles, or to the clocks. You can see that in some areas there is nothing organic or art nouveau about the style at all. These clocks are all the way through the Glasgow School of Art, and these tiles are set. These are all the tiles brought together for the picture, but this is the variation of the tiles. As you go down a very, very plain passageway, then you come across these little collections of mosaics, of insets, if you like, and I wonder whether in fact that they don't come from the Scottish tartans, that he isn't, just as he abstracted from the organic world, whether he isn't abstracting from the tartan like this. Isn't that interesting? Or again, from this one. However, I mean, you know, many people, of course, have used squares. There's nothing fantastically new about that, but I have a feeling that that well could be at the back of his mind, because he was quite nationalistic and Scottish in his aspirations. So that's a big utilitarian building with areas of enrichment. What about a domestic interior? Well, in 1900, he and Margaret MacDonald married, and they prepared, before they got married, they completely designed the interior of the house that they were going to live in. And this is the photograph from it of that time. So in 1900, they moved into one house, and then 6 years later, they bought another one, and they moved all their furniture into it. And it's that house which is then being rebuilt, and that you can go and visit as part of the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow itself. And it's these kinds of interiors that critics from London and also critics from the continent would have seen, as well as the Glasgow School of Art. And so what, of course, they noticed was that they were very, very white, very tranquil, very spare in the way that the furniture was arranged, and quite unheard of to have such a light white carpet like this. So the furniture was either painted white, or it was black. There were areas of absolute simplicity where there was nothing. There were areas of little of enrichment, which you can see in the furniture itself. So some people say, oh yes, you know, that he's so much of the arts and crafts movement. Well, yes, in a way he is. On the other hand, he's not really interested in the grain of wood. I mean, if you're going to cover wood with 6 coats of paint, etc., you're really blanking out on the material that's underneath. So that he may have come from the arts and crafts movement, but in a way he's changed it into something very, very elegant, something very, very stylish. You can see that some of them had transfers on the canvas backs, like that. So what did people think of it? Well, this is what one critic wrote at the time. This was 1904. He said, there is for the time being no possibility that rooms like this could become general, but they are milestones placed by a genius far ahead of us to mark the way to excellence for mankind in the future. So that he felt that they were difficult for the ordinary mortal to live in without clutter and without introducing any foreign element. On the other hand, of course, what he did do was that he recognized the poetry and the mood of these rooms, and he also talked about them as of a mystical and symbolic nature. So far from the Pesners, etc., and the architectural historians, in a way, seeing these rooms as prototypes of modernism, at the time they were seen as much more spiritual, much more mystical rooms of tranquility, rooms of reflection. Here are 2 more. This is a photograph of the time, and then the long chair and the desk, as it is now, that you can see in the Hunterian Museum. And then 2 more. This is the other side of the sitting room, drawing room, where you have this extraordinary ebonized, this black desk, which looks as though he's looked at Japan. He never went to Japan, but I think that the sparseness, the unclutteredness probably did come from looking through books on Japanese interiors, and then you see the same idea of having little areas of enrichment. This is a detail of that. As you opened it, so the door had this, the light could come through these little coloured areas, or you had little coloured areas inset in the picture rail that went across the window. So everything in these rooms was designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. The fireplaces, all the furniture, the colour schemes, the sconces, the candlesticks, everything was by him, and with some things by his wife. Not every room was white. The dining room and the passageways were more sober-looking, as was traditional. But it's a very good-looking room. He just used kind of cheap brown paper against the walls, and then he used sort of transfers to be able to put the trellis work. You can also say that the square comes from the trellis, that the rose bush grows up the trellis, and then you have the sort of petals falling off it. At this particular point, he never used wallpaper. Wallpaper is something, the pattern is repetitive, on and on and on and on. But if you use stencils, then of course you could have a repetition, but you could organize it in a much more personal kind of way. So it was that kind of interior which really got Charles Rennie Mackintosh, his wife, and the others in his circle the invitation to show in Vienna, in the Secession group in 1900, and in Turin in 1902, and in other places too. His rooms were shown in Dresden and also in Moscow. So this is what they looked like at the time. Here is one of Margaret MacDonald's gesso paintings, which was designed to go, with this particular room, and everything else that we can see here is by Mackintosh, except for this clock here, which was by one of the other group. The mirror here, and the chair, which we've seen, the kind of way that he liked to arrange flowers, very sort of Japanesey. So they did terribly well at these exhibitions. They were much written about, and they were seen to be very much part of what was going on in the 1900s, part of the Jugendstil, part of Art Nouveau, but yet not part of it. And so when we look at what was traditional, we have this is exactly the same period of this. This is a Glasgow ad for interior decorating, with lots of patterned carpets, lots of patterns on the wall, heavy draperies, etc. So that was the norm. But of course, at the Secession exhibition, you weren't going to have that kind of style. But when we look sideways, again, just to see what else was going on at the time, then earlier you have the Art Nouveau in Brussels of someone like Victor Horta. So if Charles Rennie Mackintosh is Art Nouveau-ish, yet it's very different from Horta. He's Art Nouveau-ish in his decoration, in the ornamentation within the chairs. But of course, the overall look of his rooms is much more rectilinear, much more severe than all these incredible lines, which are sensuous lines, which are running all over the place, as though a sort of growth of plants had become out of control, was simply taking over everything. So he's not really at all like Victor Horta and the Brussels Art Nouveau people. He's not like Hector Guimard and his chairs. I mean, none of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's chairs look Art Nouveau-ish in their silhouettes. In the slightest bit. So he's of that period. There are all sorts of little areas within his work which certainly do resonate, or they rhyme with what other people were doing. But on the other hand, he was seen as very independent, just as the others were. So that's wonderful for the Glasgow School and for Charles Rennie Mackintosh that he is recognised abroad. In fact, during his lifetime, he's much more written about in the German and the Austrian magazines than he is in London, for instance. So really they saw the interiors which were set up at those exhibitions. What about a whole domestic house? Well, this I take as my example, the Hill House, which is about 20 miles outside of Glasgow in Helensburgh. And that's of course his own drawing for it. And then just to look in a way sideways again, and to contrast it with other people. I think it's interesting that when he handed over the house to Mr. and Mrs. Blackie, Mr. Blackie was a publisher, he said, "Here is the house. It is not an Italian villa, an English mansion house, a Swiss chalet, or a Scotch castle. It is a dwelling house." So it's not a kind of a Voysey in England, which looked back to the Tudor period. It wasn't the Scots baronial style, which was full of pepper pots and full of crow-step gables and full of sort of Gothic-y kind of windows. Nor was it like Gaudi. All of these are absolutely at the same period as the Hill House. So it wasn't anything like the Barcelona Art Nouveau-ish designs of Gaudi, nor was it quite as severe as Hoffmann, as Joseph Hoffmann, whom he was a friend of in Austria. So he's somewhere in the middle. I mean, this is a severe a sort of modernist-looking style. On the other hand, being Scottish, it seems to me to come straight from the Scottish vernacular style. And but when we look at 1 year later of Hoffmann, then we see that it actually isn't nearly so innovative as the Hoffmann type of style, which was going to lead into the Bauhaus kind of a style. But it is very good looking, and Mr. Blackie was extremely pleased with his modern house by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So he said it was just a dwelling house. That is sort of rather an understatement, but from the outside it is very severe, and it is really quite plain. And in fact, this is the front door. You come through most lovely gates, wrought iron gates designed in a Mackintosh's kind of style, but you don't expect the main door to be quite small, and also to be crowned in a way by the chimney stack going up like that. But of course it's very sculptural, and being harled again, that helps. This shows how it's placed on top of a hill, looks directly south over the Firth of Clyde there. Now we're down here and looking back up at the front of the house. So, and there are Scottish things about it. Here you can see there's a little sort of garden house with a little conical roof, which rhymes with the staircase there, and both of those are very Scottish looking, but it is a kind of, it's from the Scottish vernacular, but going a bit further. Inside, one of the most spectacular rooms is the drawing room, sitting room, which is sort of divided up into about 3 sections, because you have the piano, which the piano area, he didn't design the piano, but he designed everything else. You have the kind of summer area, and then you have the fireplace area. This was a more comfortable chair for Mr. Blackie's mother, who said that she didn't find the upright ones so comfortable. So Charles Rennie Mackintosh could compromise and do something which was a little bit more padded looking. You can see that the feel of it is very light, very, very white. You have checkerboard design on the carpet, and against the walls you have the rose, the abstracted rose design, so if you have organicness within the design on the walls, you also have the most extraordinary cubist looking table there, made up of a series of cubes and squares within there, very geometric looking. So there's this geometry and this organic detailing could go absolutely side by side. So here it's beautiful illustration, I think. Checkerboards, squares, etc., with the abstracted rose. This is the fireplace area, which he also designed. Of course, well, he designed everything, the fire tongs, etc. And then Margaret MacDonald's, one of her gessos, above there, and then just tiny little areas of coloured glass set in particular places. This, I think, is the most gorgeous photograph showing how the translucent curtains with the embroidery by Margaret MacDonald rhymes beautifully with the shutters, with what's below on this kind of window table, etc. Everything is thought out and thought through. The library for Mr. Blackie is a more severe room, but look at this extraordinary way that this reed can just go straight through these little purple squares. One's always kind of looking at the whole and then zeroing in to the details. The hall here is also more sober, but you have the doors which are pierced, as is the furniture, etc. So that you get a kind of lightness, and of course the patterns from the light going through the little squares rhymes with the carpet, etc. Up the stairs and into the bedroom. The bedroom is another sort of vision in white. It was described as a bower, and there is something both terribly feminine about Charles Rennie Mackintosh's designs. But having said that, the femininity, in a way, is wonderfully contradicted by this long, slender, geometric chair. So at times he can be terribly practical, very utilitarian, and in fact Mr. Blackie sort of said that he wrote afterwards that Charles Rennie Mackintosh would think through every single way that the shelves would go in the kitchens. Nothing was too much trouble, and that everything worked wonderfully in all the back areas as well. On the other hand, in the bedroom, you could also have a chair where if you flung your trousers over the back of it, then it would tilt over. It was unstable. On the other hand, maybe you carefully put your pants or your trousers away, and you just simply used the chair as a seat for things. But somehow or other, you don't want to be untidy in this room. You would spoil it. So very gorgeous it is, and then just to put it to contrast it with George Logan, who was this is 1 year later than the Hill House, and you can see that there's decoration everywhere. It's rather sweet, it's rather childish, there's something, it's very pretty, it's rather kind of Kate Greenaway-ish. But on the other hand, when you look at Charles Rennie Mackintosh, they're both interested in using the rose. On the other hand, Charles Rennie Mackintosh has larger areas of simplicity, so there's a kind of restraint as well as a bejeweled quality in Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which makes his work look so different from Charles Logan's of the same time. So that was a house designed inside and outside by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So one of the only two that he did during his lifetime. What about the tea rooms? And what about Miss Kate Cranston? Well, Miss Kate Cranston, here she is on the left-hand side, and she evidently wore incredibly out-of-date clothes, and was a figure who swept up and down the streets of Glasgow, and she always was called Miss Cranston as her business name, but in fact she was married, and a very close marriage evidently, but continued with her business after she was married, and in fact it wasn't until her husband died that she sort of suddenly lost the zest for business and lost the zest for running her tea rooms, and then sold them all. So she comes into the story because, of course, she was a great patron of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. They seem to have got on very well together. And to begin with, in the 90s, she employed Charles Rennie Mackintosh simply to do one area. Well, actually, there were several areas. There were murals within one of her tea rooms, where the furniture was actually designed by someone else. But it's absolutely sensational. It must have been a sensational mural, which we know from the watercolour. So we're straight back to symbolism, in that you have these tall columnar-like women looking towards the tree of life. The women themselves are entwined in roses, and they're set against the male sun symbol. At the very top, you get the blossoming and the fertility of the union of the feminine with the male. And Timothy Neate will also go into all of the symbolism to do with these little serpents here, to do with these little eyes, etc., which seem to be taken from Egyptian design. So these went all the way around the room there. But at the Ingram Street tea rooms, he had the opportunity to do the whole room. And this is the one that has been set up again at the Met. So absolutely wonderful to see it. It's been lying in a warehouse since the early 70s, and has been taken out for this exhibition. So this is the old photograph, and this is what it looks like now that it's been put together again. So the ladies' luncheon room, interesting that traditionally dining rooms were sober, and in fact, as I showed you, even their own dining room was browny in its colouring. But in the ladies' luncheon room, he defied in a way tradition and made it the most wonderful, light and airy room, going up with a sort of mezzanine above, and the work is totally Mackintosh's, except for the way that there are two of these decorations. Of this is the wassail, which is by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and then at the other side of the room there was one by his wife, and then the beaten ornaments there. One was by him, I think, and one was also by Margaret. So it's here you have wonderful example of the screens that he liked to use, which and so you goes back to the idea of Japanese architecture and their use of screening, but then within it you have lovely new designs based on the tree form. It seems for the stained glass windows there, the tables all set up in the exhibition with their tablecloths and the willow pattern for the plates, but also, which we can't really see here, just the detailing, the tapering of the woodwork, which one can see beautifully in the exhibition. But out of the four tea rooms that Miss Cranston had, the one that we remember him most by is the Willow Tea Room. This is in Sauchiehall Street. It's still there. It's one of the main avenues, the main streets in Glasgow. And Sauchiehall really just means the alley of the willow. So you can imagine that Charles Rennie Mackintosh used the willow, loved the idea that Sauchiehall referred to the willow, and used the willow pattern within the ornamentation for the tea rooms. So it wasn't, he didn't have a chance, unfortunately, ever to build a new building for Miss Cranston, for any of her four tea rooms, but he was able to completely alter it. So it would have looked like these buildings on either side. So she allowed him to do a completely new ground floor, which is recessed, and then he slightly bowed the next floor with wonderful stained glass within the window there, and then he also recessed the other windows, and then put the string of squares all the way round, designed the outside signs, and of course everything inside. So it's still there, and nowadays it's a jeweler on the ground floor. But then upstairs, you can go upstairs, and there are tea rooms round the balcony, and also there's also the tea room in the Salon de Luxe, the room of luxury, which we'll see in a minute or two. So, and it's most of what's there has actually been recreated. On the other hand, just walking through it and being able to go there and have a snack, it is great fun, and it is wonderful, to see how everything does fit together so splendidly. So these tea rooms were made up of quite a number of rooms. They had nothing to do with Yieldy tea room, Yieldy tea shoppy, or any of that stuff, which you see all around England today. They weren't oldie worldy at all. They were the most up-to-date, styly, arty places to go to. And Miss Cranston belonged to the temperance movement. So if you were going to entice people in to have a snack, to have a lunch, to have teas, etc., then, of course, it was only sensible, it was only businesslike to have interiors which were so talked about, which were so written about in the press, that people, of course, would want to go to them. The second reason that they were so popular was that bars were not a terribly good place at all for women to go to, and her tea rooms were very popular with women. Women were now going out on their own, unaccompanied by menfolk, to do their shopping, to go to the museums, etc. So could meet with each other to have lunch. But there were also, well, they weren't exclusively for women, and there were rooms which were for men, rooms which were women, rooms which were mixed dining, and then there were upstairs in all her establishments. There were smoking rooms, of course, for men, and billiard rooms, and for men. So they were large establishments, and as time went by, she kept on adding to them, taking on a building next door, and then she'd bring in Charles Rennie Mackintosh to design yet another room. So she did very well, made a lot of money out of them, and even though her clothes were very old-fashioned, yet everything to do with her tea rooms was of the latest style. So, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, here we are, we've come in, and it's as though we've got our back to the street as well. So you can see that there was the front lunchroom was like this, and then you went through into this middle area, which was designed in a different way, with a kind of canopy over this dining area here. With flowers, which I'm sure Charles Rennie Mackintosh would have been extremely disapproving of. They don't look at all nice. And then it was here which you could just see that you had the very, very famous order desk chair, which looks like this, which is on the cover of the Met's catalogue. And this is both absolutely geometric, but at the same time is also said to come from the willow tree idea. Here's the trunk going up. Here are the branches, and here is the weeping willow coming downwards. So it can be read in both ways, as a stunning geometric design, or as an abstracted a design abstracted from nature itself. In the back, which was here, you had the darker room, the oak room, and so there were low chairs and sturdy chairs. There were higher chairs. So he didn't want everything looking the same. At all, and of course all the fireplaces and all the decoration was different in every single area. Upstairs around the balcony, you had this kind of arrangement with light absolutely sort of flooding in from above. And then on another one on this side, this is what it looks like without its chairs and tables. So I think even just looking at the way he designed the balcony here and the columns, you can see that there's nothing standardized about anything that Charles Rennie Mackintosh does. Everything is designed afresh. Everything has to be handcrafted to be able to get all the different forms which he designed for these tea rooms. But the most expensive room, where tea was just a penny more than it was elsewhere, was the Salon de Luxe. And here's the door. This is a detail of the door, which is at the Met, which you came into here. And then inside, you had chairs which were actually silver. This is all silver colour, with a kind of purpley sort of rosy kind of upholstery. I mean, it really was a bit too much, for me anyway. On the other hand, when we ask what people thought about it at the time, I think it's very interesting that here's a review which is absolutely gushing about the whole thing. It says, "Hitherto, Miss Cranston has been famous for the daintily artistical character of her several establishments." So they were arty. However, her new establishment, which is the Willow Tea Rooms, fairly outshines all others in the matters of arrangement and colour. The furnishings, besides, are of the richest and most luxurious character. Indeed, Miss Cranston has carried the question of comfort fairly into that of luxury. And that's interesting because lots of people say that Charles Rennie Mackintosh's chairs are incredibly uncomfortable. But this reviewer specifically says that they're very comfortable. And of course, people would sit up properly, and women would wear their corsets, and they would not lean against the back of the chairs anyway. So they had a sort of slightly different, probably, attitude towards what a comfortable chair was. So he says the whole thing is very, very comfortable, and comfort fairly into that of luxury. When providing for the enjoyment of her friends and patrons. Her salon de luxe, which is what we see here, is on the first floor, is simply a marvel of the art of the upholsterer and decorator. And not the least admirable, each in its own way, are the tea gallery, the lunchrooms, the billiard room, and the smoking room. So, of course, perfect, wonderful publicity, and everybody would want to come and see the latest of these tea rooms. And in Margaret MacDonald's contribution was in one side there was a fireplace, and then the other side there was this gesso panel, and it's very interesting because it's a direct quote from Rossetti. So we come back to this influence of the symbolism of the Pre-Raphaelites, and it's entitled. It comes from one of Rossetti's poems, "O ye who walk in willow wood," and so that goes nicely, of course, with the willow tea rooms. He also designed what the waitresses would wear, the choker, the bow, the dress, and then of course he could also design the cutlery to go with any of Miss Cranston's establishments or as a private commission. So this was 1903. So just sort of, rather briefly, with some of the other things that he did, he did two schools. This is the second one, the Scotland Street School. So again, he could do something which was much more functional, wonderful great staircases for the children, light flooding in, just little areas of decoration, but otherwise quite plain. He also, in the first decade of the 20th century, he finished the Glasgow School of Art, and he redesigned this area, which became the very, very famous library. So the library, as you can see, is a room with dark wood and incredibly mannered. Indeed, you have the balcony here, which doesn't rest straight on its columns, but the columns come out. And then you have all sorts of little areas of not this sort of opalescent kind of rosy colours of the earlier period, but much stronger colours against the stained wood of the library. It's an extraordinary room with these great big windows that go all the way up. So in this first decade, he certainly had that to finish off. But by 1910, he really wasn't doing very much. In fact, that the difficulties within the office were aggravated. In that Honeyman had by that time died, and so even though Charles Rennie Mackintosh was a partner, so that it was Honeyman, Keppie, and Mackintosh, yet he and John Keppie seemed to work in very different ways, and they basically kept their work separate, so that, for instance, if Charles Rennie Mackintosh was getting work, he was busy. If he himself didn't get work, then he didn't get work which was passed on to him from John Keppie. So in 1910, 11, 12, with the climax in 13, you get the situation where John Keppie feels that Charles Rennie Mackintosh is not pulling his weight. He's not bringing in the amount of money that he's being paid as a partner. You get squabbles over work hours. You get squabbles over how the office was being run, etc. And you get Keppie blaming Mackintosh for simply not bringing in work, because he's become known as a difficult architect. That, for instance, with the school, he wasn't invited to do another school, partly probably because A, the school was over the budget, and B, because Charles Rennie Mackintosh had fights with the Glasgow board over the size of the panes of the glass. And it was this kind of sort of obsession with details and the inability to change and to compromise that made, of course, Charles Rennie Mackintosh difficult to work with clients. I suppose another reason, was that it was a kind of, the style was so embracing, it was the total work of art that the whole house became. So it was difficult for many people who maybe had their own furniture, who had their own ideas, who had their own paintings, for instance. Nothing of that really fits in a Charles Rennie Mackintosh interior, though indeed at the Hill House there were compromises. In the dining room, for instance, is less of an interesting room because there were the family portraits and they did have their own dining room chairs and tables, etc. But a client had to allow Charles Rennie Mackintosh to at least have most of the public rooms in his own style. And so I suppose that drove many people away. So by 1913, he hasn't had very much work. He's in a very bad state of health anyway. He was subject to bouts of depression anyway. He'd been drinking for a number of years, quite a lot. And I think the climax came when he, on behalf of Honeyman and Keppie and Mackintosh, was supposed to have finished some designs for a competition, and he never got them finished in time. He is pushed out of the firm, and he decides that he'll set up on his own. Between 1913 and 1914, he doesn't get any work. He does nothing. He doesn't have any work at all. So in 1914, his wife, Margaret MacDonald, takes him on a holiday south to Walberswick to recover. And there are letters from her at that particular time where she says that she thinks that her husband will need about a year to recover. So he must have been in a pretty bad state of health at that particular time. He seems to have almost had a kind of breakdown. What Timothy Neate says, about him is that he feels that he says that he was to be subject to recurrent bouts of depression throughout his life, and his all-or-nothing behaviour suggests he was a man of the manic-depressive type. So that when everything was going right, and when he was working with a client like Miss Cranston, who simply let him have his head, as it were, then they seem to have worked very, very well together. On the other hand, without a sympathetic client like her or like Mr. Blackie, then he just got into squabbles and quarrels with the clients. So it was at this particular time that when recuperating down by the sea in Suffolk, that he begins doing these drawings of the gorse on the left-hand side and on the right rosemary. So here we're far away from symbolism, far away from everything to do with the rose, the tree of life, etc. It's as though to recuperate, he had to go back to square one in a way and just simply draw exactly what was in front of him. And they're very beautiful, they're lovely in their own way. Well, 1914, that's exactly when war broke out. So what was started out as a kind of recuperative holiday landed up as them staying down in England. And in fact, Charles Rennie Mackintosh never went back to Glasgow ever. They rented out their beautiful, pristine, white drawing room house, etc. And they stayed in England from 1914 to 1923. So he was really out. He had no practice. He had a little by the seaside, etc. There was no way that he could get anything going. And during the war, no new buildings were allowed to go up in any case. So he goes to London in 1915, and he does try to set up. And during those years, 1915 to 1923, he lives in Chelsea. He gets to know all sorts of artists, interesting enough, and he has various projects which, as I suppose for many architects, that they're drawn up, there's great excitement, they look as though they're going ahead, but they never do, and so he begins to do more watercolors, which look like this, vases of flowers, and then he begins to design for fabric and for wallpapers. There were evidently about 400 of these designs, and he and Margaret did them. I think mostly Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And he would try to sell them to different firms. Most of them seem to have disappeared. But what is so interesting is that he obviously was evolving a different kind of a style with much stronger colours. And for the one English commission that he did get, we see some very, very interesting new work. So these are the doors of 78 Derngate, and it was a tiny little house, a brick house, and so his commission was simply to redo the inside, which he did. And it looks like this. The Met has recreated part of it. They've recreated this part in the exhibition, and you can see that something has happened to his style. And in a way, it came more gradually than these photographs suggest. But and so here you have the checkerboard, which is here, but there's nothing organic, nothing rose-like about it. But instead, in a way, it's as though if to begin with he was balancing the square of reason, the square of intellect, with the more Art Nouveau type of style. It's as though at this point he's dropped everything to do with the Art Nouveau plant-like style and has simply developed the geometric elements which were already in his work. So here you get these chevrons, these triangles, etc. The room was black. It was a sitting room sort of hall. It's very small, and you have these decorations on the wall of strong yellows and against the blacks and the whites. And within the paneling here, you also get stained glass windows, stained glass. So he's still using in a way the same elements that he used before, but now it's in a kind of proto sort of Art Deco kind of style, and it's almost, you feel as though there's almost too much of it, it's almost overdone. It's almost as if, Mackintosh had so few commissions and he's so bubbling over with a new style, with new ideas for decoration, that he just pours his new ideas into these tiny little spaces. So the domino clock, he's back in form again. He could design everything again from top to toe. In the guest bedroom, isn't this utterly extraordinary? This is recreated in the Hunterian Museum so that you can see it there. And so what you get really is Charles Rennie Mackintosh now looking to see what's happening on the continent. So if in the beginning of the 19th century, he may well have influenced the Joseph Hoffmanns, the people that were in Austria, in Germany, etc., or at least his work is very parallel to what they were doing. Yet at this particular point, in 1917, then he is now using, this is Urban's work, U-R-B-A-N, of earlier pre-war work. He's now taking the idea of the stripes, etc., and reinterpreting it in his own way, in an incredibly bold way, so that you get these strong royal blue colours on the material, on the chair and also the stool, which of course is picked up in the bedspread, which is picked up in the stripes. The stripes are actually black and white with this strong blue in between, and the stripes going from the bedspread up the wall and along the ceiling, as well. And it was also carried through into the curtains, etc. Absolutely amazing. So the anecdote goes that when George Bernard Shaw was a guest in this room in 1923, his host sort of took him up to the guest bedroom, and as they looked at this incredibly striking room with all its stripes, the host said rather lamely, "Oh, I hope that you'll sleep all right." And George Bernard Shaw is said to have remarked, "Yes, indeed, I always sleep with my eyes closed." It's rather marvelous. So here we have an example of a 1917 design which suggests that Charles Rennie Mackintosh, had he been given the commissions, he could have gone on to be a very, very striking art deco designer, but he doesn't. In 1923, he and Margaret go to France. Why? Well, here we come back to this sort of these different interpretations. That one of them says, for instance, with the hopes of a continuing architectural career fading, the Mackintoshes left London for the south of France. So all rather easy, etc., and living cheaply in a warm climate. It was a quiet and contented end to Mackintosh's creative life. So, living in the Hotel de Commerce as one of their homes. They never had a home again. They just lived in hotels. And Charles Rennie Mackintosh going out when the weather was good and doing his watercolors. That interpretation suggests that the pair of them they were a very close couple. That he absolutely adored Margaret, and a gentle end to his life. It was right there that they were in the Pyrenees. They went up to the Pyrenees in the summer, and then were down by the sea during the winter. And this is what he looks like at this time. He seems to have got over his drinking and instead just joined the warmth and the wine of France. And these watercolours, there are 41 of them between 1923 and his death in 1928, are rather extraordinary. I mean, they are very individual. This kind of exaggerated sense of perspective. Here are the rocks in the photograph on the right, and here they are here. And they weren't topographical, and he moved things around. But it's also sort of like a sort of stage set in a way. You don't get the feeling of heaviness or weight. It's almost as though these really are kind of thin layers of rocks, side by side, almost cardboard in their linearity. That are there. But what he had hoped was that after he had 50, that he would have an exhibition in London, and that they would be seen together. So what in fact does happen? Well, they know very few people, of course, in France. Some friends drop by. He doesn't speak French, so he's really kind of living the life of an exile. But in 1927, he seems to have a growth on his tongue, and he goes back to London to be looked at by the doctors there, and is discovered that he has cancer of the tongue. He has an operation, his tongue is cut out, he's not able to talk anymore, and the only thing that he seems to want to do is to be able to live in a house which has a garden at the back, so that he can, in his speechless condition, he can sit outside in the garden. The cancer operation was not enough. The cancer spread. In 1928, he died. So he simply sort of fades out, or does he? You can see that my interpretation is that a brilliant man comes his career comes to an end for various reasons, and even though the watercolors are very wonderful, one feels that he wasn't living up to his potential in the last few years in his life. Margaret MacDonald lives on for about 4 more years. She wanders from hotel to hotel. She goes back to France. She seems to scatter his ashes there, and then she dies. And then that's the end of both of them. They very sadly never had any children, which they hoped to have. And so he was left with just really a few people, a few fans, a few friends who looked after their estate. The objects that they owned at that particular point were really valued as being absolutely valueless, etc. And so it takes quite a long time for Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work to come back before the public eye again. So for my last two slides, I put Frank Lloyd Wright, because Frank Lloyd Wright was only 1 year older than Charles Rennie Mackintosh. But yet, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright lives until 1959. 1959, Charles Rennie Mackintosh died in 1928, so 30 years more longer than Charles Rennie Mackintosh. On the other hand, Frank Lloyd Wright, he had his ups and downs. He didn't have his career wasn't that easy. On the other hand, there was something about Charles Rennie Mackintosh which was not strong enough in a way to take in a way he was too vulnerable, maybe, to be able to deal with people and to be able to work well with people and to take what he thought of was the sort of hostility, towards his style. Whereas, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright, there was something very authoritarian about him. He was very, very resilient. He wrote his own autobiography. He gave lectures, etc. He was a great proselytizer of his own work. He had students who, of course, lived with him for free, worked for him, etc. And so in the 1930s, he designed Falling Water, outside and inside, and then, of course, in his 80s, went on to design the Guggenheim. So it's, in a way, there's no point in playing the idea of what if. But I think that what I would leave you with is the fact that even though Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Frank Lloyd Wright come out of the same arts and crafts roots, yet I think Timothy Neate is right that because Charles Rennie Mackintosh is a product also of the 1890s symbolism, the interest in the spirituality and the vocabulary of that symbolism. I think that even though we saw at the very end that he could have evolved into an Art Deco designer, yet there was something too fragile about his personality which actually blocked his creativity and which really left him out in the cold for the last almost 20 years of his life. Thank you very much.